Excellent. Yes. So we have an initiative called the Counter Canon Challenge, CCC for short. The Counter Canon Challenge is this essentially. We get invited into modules. We invite students who are enrolled in those classes to volunteer to take up the challenge to cite at least 20% racialized scholars. We have some initiatives to support them in that process. That is, we keep a list of references for folks to review. We have a mentoring scheme that we all volunteer. Well, we get a stipend for shepherding people through our list and introducing the students who volunteer to take up the challenge to be introduced to racialized scholars and to cite them in their summative assignments. We, once the students submit their summative assignments, they submit their reference lists to us, and then we code them for racialization. We have created a typology of racialization that is ever evolving. I'll tell you that. At this point in time, we have been coding for 4 types of racialization. Visible racialization, institutional racialization, geographic racialization, and political racialization. The process for coding each type of racialization is slightly different, but the one that's the most relevant to this conversation is the political racialization. Those who, scholars who publish on the decolonizing initiative. And for each discipline, we create a word bank of terms that are relevant to that discipline and to the decolonizing initiative. And then we run PDFs of the reference list through something called the glob reader in Python, and it gives us the number of times the words in the word bank are referenced in the text, and then we create a threshold for a benchmark for the number of times in terms that terms are referenced in a text to code that text as politically racialized. And in order to introduce us to politically racialized scholars, we invite scholars, racialized scholars in particular, to come and present to us to introduce us to their work. And so we have this lecture series, and we're excited to invite you, Professor Kawashima, to give us a lecture on your work. So I'll pass it to Shu. Thank you.
Okay, now I think it's the time we introduce Professor Kawashima and let him give the lecture. So Professor Kawashima is Associate Professor at University of Toronto, and he is the author of the Proletarian Gamble, Korean Workers in Interwar Japan, co-editor of Tosaka Jun, critical reader, and the English translator of Kozo's Theory of Crisis. And he teaches courses on the history of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism in East Asia, on everyday life, on racism and fascism, and on Marxist theory. So now we welcome Professor Kawashima to give his lecture first, and after the lecture ends, we will take the questions and answers. So please, Professor Kawashima, please just start your part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. Thanks all the way to all of you in London. Thank you for inviting me to this to speak about my work. I've been recently giving lectures on these 2 books of mine. These 2. So is this PowerPoint showing up for you guys? Okay, is it all clear? Because I've been using since the pandemic. I've been using more PowerPoint, and I find it useful. So these are the 2 books that kind of mean the most to me of my own. And the first book, The Proletarian Gamble, that's a very historical book, and The Theory of Crisis, which was written in Japanese and published in Japan in 1953. This Theory of Crisis, I actually read it when I was doing my research for The Proletarian Gamble. And theoretical aspects of the theory of crisis really guided my historical inquiry. So I thought I would talk about first about my history book, and then talk about the theory of crisis, and hopefully it'll be clear how they're related to each other. But one thing I wanted to just say about Uno Kozo, a very famous Japanese Marxist. There's a very robust tradition of Marxism in Japan, especially from, I would say, the 1930s to the late 1960s. And I just wanted to point out that he has a very specific method for political economy, and it looks a bit like this. He has 3 levels of analysis for political economy. The first is a theory of the fundamental principles of political economy, and this is based on Marx's Capital, Das Kapital. And Uno's book, Theory of Crisis, he includes his book, The Theory of Crisis, in this level. And this is a very abstract, logical level of analysis. He has a second level of analysis called the theory of the historical stages of capitalist development, where he breaks down the history of capitalism in stages really influenced by Lenin's analysis of imperialism as the highest stage. And what Uno did was filled in the other stages. He calls it mercantilism and liberalism. And these 2 first aspects of his methodology are, he wants us to have these 2 levels of analysis in our minds before we conduct the third level, which is what he calls the analysis of the present conjuncture, or we could call it a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And so I want to talk about first my book of history, and influenced by especially Uno's world historical stages of capitalism. So world historically, he says there's three stages: mercantilism, liberalism, and imperialism. These are the significant periods, the significant dominant countries, hegemonic countries, the dominant forms of capital, and the significant economic crises that define each stage. And his point is that every country that develops capitalism will repeat these 3 stages. Doesn't matter where it is. He argues these stages will be repeated no matter where we're talking about. So when I did my study of modern Japanese history, these stages kind of helped shape my own understanding of of capitalist development in Japan, which would look like this. We have a 32-year period of mercantilism, a very short period of liberalism, and a very long period of imperialism. So this is kind of a broad historical framework for my historical study. And if there's one theoretical point about the theory of crisis, it's that here, when we look at capitalism and its logic, he calls it the logic of capital. This logic is actually a cycle of capitalist accumulation, and he defines these 3 phases of capitalist accumulation as prosperity, crisis, and depression. So crisis is just really a phase of capitalist accumulation. It's in the middle of these 2 other phases. Crisis will then lead to a period of economic depression, and out of that depression comes another period of prosperity. So it's like a vicious cycle. And this is all just a theoretical exposition in Uno's work, but it gives us a way to break down historical developments in terms of these 3 phases. So what I did in my book was I looked at Korean worker struggles in Japan in terms of these stages of capitalism and also in terms of these phases of capitalist accumulation. So, for example, during World War I, this was a period of economic prosperity in Japan, and Korean worker struggles were very pronounced, mostly in the extractive industries in Hokkaido. And for a very short period of time, they dealt with police, they dealt with these dangerous conditions, and there was struggles. Then there's another phase of prosperity in World War II, about 25, 30 years later. This is a time of also of economic prosperity and of world war, which of course ended with the nuclear bombs over Japan, the occupation of Japan, but also it's a time of what the Japanese Empire called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which came to an end when the US Allied occupation basically took over, subjugated Japan. So between these two periods of prosperity, economic prosperity, which are also periods of world war, there's this long trough, a long period of economic crisis and depression. And that's where I noticed most of the Korean worker struggles appearing. And it looks a little bit like this. There's a whole bunch of different struggles during the economic crisis and depression period. And I won't go over all of them. I just want to give you an image of how vast these struggles were during economic crisis and economic depression. I would note, for example, especially there were struggles in the construction industry by Koreans. That was kind of the main topic of my book, The Proletarian Gamble, where they fought against non-payment of wages and what they called intermediary exploitation. We see political organizing in around 1925 to 1934 with different communist labor unions, factional federations, splittings. We see Korean struggles from the point of production into housing questions around 1929. Struggles against the police, struggles against anti-fascist struggles, and struggles against institutional problems of discrimination in the unemployment agencies and so forth. So I just wanted to give you a sense that, you know, when we use Uno's lens, theoretically and historically, it helped me kind of organize and make sense out of these Korean struggles, which were so vast. So here's a blank page. I just want to read a couple things. So this book, The Proletarian Gamble, it's really about the political struggles of Korean workers amidst economic crisis and depression in the capitalist stage of imperialism. I argue that these struggles shared a common ground in what could be called, following Uno's work, the commodification of labor power. And I'll talk about that in detail in a few minutes. But basically what really inspired me doing this research as a historian was how within the immediate crisis of these colonized Korean workers' struggles, what was so inspiring to see was how they acted so decisively to identify as quickly and as best as they could the most immediate and direct causes of their experiences of injury and misery, poverty and oppression, and to negate them and overcome them in practice. And sometimes their actions succeeded and sometimes they did not. But this led to the emergence of a plurality of interpretations of the different identifications and of sources of injury. But arguably, because of this plurality of interpretations, it also became possible for many of these workers to misrecognize or confuse deep causes of their suffering with more immediate causes of their suffering. For example, many Koreans that I studied came to believe that the cheap wages that were paid to them by Japanese capitalists, that is when they were paid, was caused by the fact that they were discriminated against by Japanese simply for being Korean. However, if we think about it, being Korean itself is ultimately the result of the accidental occurrence of their birth in a country called Korea, but being Korean, quote unquote, commonly came to be interpreted as the basic cause of their oppression, as well as of their cheap wages. So in short, this purely accidental character of being Korean was somehow turned into an inevitable and necessary cause of their oppression, and often being Korean was even considered to be the only cause of their oppression, as if they believed that they could be liberated from oppression if only they were not discriminated against for being Korean. So was this an accident? This is an example, I think, of the difficult problems of the colonial question, the national question, as well as of many problems of liberalism and its many expressions of pluralism. And I think it's also an example of what my colleague and friend and comrade Asad Haider of York University, what he's called so helpfully a mistaken identity, which has a politically neutralizing effect upon mass movements, especially as a racial ideology. But when we think about Japanese history and the fascist, imperialist, Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, we could say that the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere is a good example of this kind of racial and national ideology. It is the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which was the Japanese Empire, was arguably something that mass-produced many mistaken identities and liberal colonial subjects. The problem is that Korean workers in Japan often did not recognize that their belief in being Korean as the perceived cause of their oppression unwittingly played into the racial, multi-ethnic, and national ideology of the Japanese state and empire, which was so full of contradictions. For example, while the Japanese empire promoted the quote-unquote assimilation of Koreans into Japanese society, demanding Koreans effectively quote-unquote become Japanese, at the same time, Korean workers were never imagined or really allowed to be anything else but Korean. Many Korean workers failed to recognize that by believing that being Korean was the cause of their oppression, they had tragically and unbeknownst to them played into the strategies and policies of the metropolitan and colonial state apparatus, which strove indefatigably after 1917 to divide and conquer the working class overall as a class by institutional techniques and practices, which forced upon the impoverished masses ethno-national and racial identities one by one, precisely as a politically neutralizing technique of preventing workers from identifying with being a worker and a member of a proletarian class. This, I call it a mistaken identity, also felt, I mean, Asad Haider calls it a mistaken identity, I borrow his term. This mistaken identity basically also fell prey to diverse strategies of biopolitical institutions, such as those of the police and welfare organizations, which liberally created techniques of inter-worker competition during the economic depression. And these institutions individuated populations of workers by bureaucratic and administrative means, and according to diverse categories of power knowledge, as well as by means of brute police violence on the streets. So the fundamental historical questions that I was interested in were, how were the historical realities of these Korean workers and their concrete situation and the realities of their political practice? How were they linked or not linked together in struggle and within the crisis of their own everyday lives? How was the historical reality of capitalist crisis and the reality of their struggles articulated or not articulated? How can we account not only for what these workers were struggling against, and what they articulated in discourse, but also for what they were not always able to perceive or represent as objective problems of their historical reality. So here, I think we really need to have theory. If we want to develop the implications of the concrete historical struggles of the Korean workers in Japan, who were not only struggling against forms of domination, but who were also struggling to even make sense of their reality, it is not enough to speak only on their behalf and in historical and empirical terms. It's not enough to simply ventriloquize the Korean workers' words only. It is also necessary, I believe, to speak in theoretical terms and on behalf of what the workers were not able, for whatever reason, to perceive or represent as objective problems. I don't think this is to ignore or to deny or disavow the workers' historical thinking or their voices of political dissent. Rather, it is to give theoretical reason for the reality, concreteness, and essence of their practical struggles. So the point of theory is not to detract attention away from the concrete singularity of their struggles. It's rather to give added theoretical reason to ground their active intuition, their courage, and their political practice, and to overcome many mistaken identities. And with this idea, I want to now jump into really some theoretical problems that come from Uno Kozo's book. Uno Kozo's Theory of Crisis, published in 1953. We can ask, what is the use value of this book? I would say its use is a theoretical use value. And what does this book show? The use value is a theoretical demonstration of the necessity or inevitability and periodicity of the phenomenon of capitalist crisis, parentheses, from what I would call the perspective of an ontology of capital. And basically what Uno's book teaches us then is that we are deluding ourselves if we think that capitalist crisis is accidental to capitalism, or that it is simply possible under capitalism, under the capitalist mode of production. Uno, more, I think, inconsolably, shows us that capitalist crisis is a phenomenon that is inevitable under capitalism. And it is also periodic. So he wants to show that it's necessary or inevitable and necessarily periodic under capitalism. And I think the most important point of Uno's theory of crisis is that when he talks about the phenomenon of capitalist crisis, and I'll specify that in a second, he says, what causes this phenomenon? He argues that that capitalist crisis is caused fundamentally by the same historical and materialist process that also establishes the capitalist mode of production. And for him, that is what he calls the commodification of labor power, which is Uno's way of basically encapsulating what Karl Marx called the sale and purchase of labor power as a commodity in chapter 6 of Das Kapital. And as we all know, when Marx talked about the sale and purchase of labor power as a commodity, Marx says that this is what what he says, this exchange inaugurates the capitalist epoch and establishes the capitalist mode of production. So Uno calls it the commodification of labor power. And he not only, so for Uno, however, the commodification of labor power not only represents the perspective from which he theoretically reconstructs the origins of the capitalist mode of production. It also represents the perspective from which he proposes to initiate the revolutionary transition from capitalism to socialism and communism. And as he wrote in his book, Capital and Socialism from 1958, he says, the planned economy and socialist movements should begin precisely on the basis of the abolition and overcoming of the process of the commodification of labor power. So how does Uno's theory of crisis compare with other Marxist theories of crisis, which also refer to capital? His book has a very different perspective on capital and is very different from orthodox Marxist theories of crisis. For example, theories of the tendency of the profit rate to fall, or theories of overproduction and underconsumption. For Uno, he says that these problems, falling rates of profit or overproduction, are derivative problems of the more fundamental or ontological problem of the commodification of labor power. In other words, we wouldn't even have falling rates of profit or overproduction and underconsumption if labor power was not commodified. So Uno says that the commodification of labor power is the fundamental kind of trigger mechanism for all of these other problems. And unlike other Marxist theories of crisis, when Uno defines this phenomenon of capitalist crisis, he says that it should be understood as a contradiction between, on the one hand, excess capital on the one hand, and surplus populations on the other hand. So his book clarifies not only how, under the capitalist mode of production, poverty and chronic unemployment are necessarily coexistent alongside excessive wealth and affluence, it also clarifies how and why the ruling classes are periodically and completely incapable of managing their own products of labor as capital. Uno shows that the so-called market rationality under a capitalist mode of production can only operate normally, quote unquote, through its own irrationality, inoperability, and brokenness, most clearly visible in this huge contradiction between excess capital and surplus populations. And this is stuff I've written about with Gavin Walker in 2018 for Viewpoint, and I also wrote about this in the Handbook of Marxism that Alberto Toscano and Sarah Ferris and others edited. So we could say, why did Uno bother to demonstrate the necessity or inevitability of crisis theoretically? And here we can, I think it's helpful to distinguish Uno's approach from Lenin's approach to capitalist crisis, not in order to negate Lenin, but to make Lenin's argument, to ground it theoretically and to make it stronger. For example, in A Characterization of Economic Romanticism from 1897, Lenin famously defined capitalist crisis as, quote, the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of appropriation. Now, this is a famous, every Marxist knows this phrase. But what Uno says is that Uno doesn't deny this contradiction that Lenin talks about, but he emphasizes that this contradiction can only explain the possibility of capitalist crisis. It cannot explain the inevitability and periodicity of capitalist crisis. Uno writes, a true elucidation of crisis will not be possible unless we understand this contradiction, the contradiction of social production and private appropriation, in terms of the fundamental contradiction of capitalist society that derives from the commodification of labor power. The contradiction of social production and private appropriation is common in the capitalist commodity economy, and while it can be said that this contradiction reinforces the possibility of crisis, it is not the ground of the inevitability of crisis. So in Uno's thinking, The fundamental ground of the inevitability of crisis is identified as the commodification of labor power. He writes, the phenomenon of crisis, which represents the fundamental contradictions of capitalist society, while simultaneously resolving them practically, is grounded precisely in the commodification of labor power. So here we can ask, what does it really mean to speak of the contradiction of the commodification of labor power? How is this the fundamental contradiction of capitalist society? Because for Uno, he wants to say it's because of this fundamental contradiction that all the other contradictory phenomenon in the economic base appear in the first place. So how can he explain this fundamental contradiction that labor power represents as a commodity? We can state this contradiction axiomatically in what I would call a double bind of capital. In order for capital to produce surplus value and profit, capitalists must do what? They must consume as a commodity that which capital cannot produce as a commodity directly, namely our labor power. So in other words, capitalism, capitalists, to make profit and surplus value, they have to consume labor power as a commodity. But the double bind is they cannot produce labor power as a commodity directly because only we, human beings, possess labor power, and capital obviously cannot produce us directly as a commodity. I mean, this point can also be extended, I think, or challenged productively in terms of the question of slavery, where the body does become a commodity, but Uno is emphasizing labor power as a commodity, and he's trying to argue, following Marx, not just about slavery, but also basically wage slavery. So this is the basic contradiction that Uno wants to focus on. That he wants to focus on this contradiction that labor power represents as a commodity. He writes, the commodification of labor power forms the fundamental basis of capitalist society, but since labor power is not originally produced as a commodity by capital, yet is transformed into one, labor power in this sense is the fundamental weak point of capitalist society. So when we think about this problem, what I would say is that when we think of the logic of capital or the logic of the commodity form that dominates a capitalist society, we have to recognize that it's not a hermetically sealed, closed system. There's this point of différance, a kind of agonistic point of difference and undecidability that's kind of built into this logic precisely around our labor power as a commodity, which exposes capitalism's Achilles heel, its weak point. And I think it's important to emphasize this gap because it allows Uno to talk about a very special problem in capitalism. And he says that capital, because of this problem around our labor power as a commodity, capital has to always pass through a kind of, this has to pass through this gap, but it can only do so by means of violence and force. This is what Uno calls the muri, a kind of absence of reason. He calls it this, that the commodification of labor power always goes through or passes through or reveals this muri, which is a kind of place of nothingness or an absence of reason. So if you look at these two characters in red, the first character is mu, or nothingness, and the second character is di, or reason. And if you put them together, it says muri. And what it means is that there's some impossibility that's happening when labor power is commodified. or it could be there's some kind of a refusal, or it could mean a kind of forcing of the commodification of labor power. But it also means there's some absence of reason when labor power is commodified. We could say that, borrowing from Jacques Lacan's discourse, we could say that Uno's concept of this moody represents the real of class struggle, which resists representation. But Uno is also saying that if this moody is traversed, if capital is successfully able to pass through this gap, then the outcome will be nothing short of inevitable and periodic capitalist crisis. So basically what Uno's trying to say is that we need to think about the commodification of labor power, because that's what we do when we go to work every day. But theoretically speaking, there's a kind of impossibility of this problem from capital's perspective. Capital has this weak point around our labor power as a commodity, and therefore Uno wants to say capital must pass through this gap, and usually it needs to have violence or force to ensure that labor power can be commodified. He wants to say, Uno wants to say that therefore we need to be aware of how we sell our labor power as a commodity, because when we do so, it will lead to inevitable and periodic capitalist crisis, defined as excessive capital on the one hand and unemployed, impoverished, surplus populations on the other. And therefore, he says, basically, we should learn how to refuse to sell our labor power as a commodity. And he calls it the overcoming and abolition of the commodification of labor power. Roudoryoku Shoinka no Shio. And this term Shio is the Japanese translation of the German word Aufheben, or Aufhebung, the Hegelian term for the kind of of overcoming and sublation. He wants to say that we should negate and abolish the commodification of labor power. And so really this book is about the commodification of labor power. And how do we think about the commodification of labor power? I would suggest that we think of it as a pivot. And a pivot between what? On the one hand, it marks the terminal point of the process of expropriation and dispossession, the end point of the disintegration of pre-capitalist agrarian communities, and the apogee of the historical development of the commodity form in society. So the commodification of labor power completes the despotism of the commodity form and concludes the process that began with the commodification of land and the expropriation, theft, and dispossession of land from so-called pre-capitalist communities. But on the other hand, the commodification of labor power marks the beginning point of properly capitalist exploitation and accumulation. The commodification of labor power thus represents the pivot between capitalist expropriation and exploitation. And it could look a little bit like this. We have the process of expropriation, what Marx called primitive accumulation. And on the other side of this process of the commodification of labor power, we see exploitation and capitalist accumulation. And Uno wants to say that the commodification of labor power is the end point of expropriation and the beginning point of exploitation. So Marxist theory needs to clarify this, and that's what Uno is trying to do. As this pivot, we can also say that it impacts our subjectivity. From the perspective of subject formation, it's a big pivot around which we experience great torsion. And I would also add that we can look at it from the perspective of subjectivity and the proletariat, as well as looking at this problem from a Foucauldian perspective, of different forms of power, power knowledge, power and the truth. Here I spent a lot of time trying to bridge Marx's analysis with Foucault's analysis of biopolitical power and disciplinary power. I see them deeply, deeply related, and yet many Marxists don't really analyze Foucault's work, and many Foucauldians never read Marx's work, but I'm trying to combine them, okay? So the most important lesson of theory of crisis is not only that the commodification of labor power represents the secret of capitalist crisis, it also represents a crucial yet understudied historical and materialist vector of power, knowledge, subjection, and domination, but also of potential subjectivation, emancipation, and revolutionary consciousness. So we do not study the commodification of labor power in order to simply explain or demonstrate the inevitability and periodicity of capitalist crisis, theoretically. Rather, what we should do, the analysis of the inevitability of crisis should lead us back to the historical and political problem of the radical and violent contingencies that are structurally endemic to the position of selling labor power as a commodity. And this contingency can also be expressed as the aleatory encounter between owners of labor power and owners of money capital. And my last section, really, I want to turn to some thoughts by Marx and Louis Althusser, because I think they resonate with Uno's project around problems of politics, practice, and philosophy. So I will wrap this up quickly. I want to turn to politics, philosophy, and what I'm calling a little bit of poetry. I think one of the challenges for me as a historian, but one of the most exciting challenges of writing history, of writing a history of the present under the domination of the capitalist mode of production, is that it must account for this historical encounter between owners of labor power on one side and owners of money capital on the other side. As Karl Marx wrote in Das Kapital, in order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labor, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labor, in other words, labor power. So here Marx is describing how the capitalist has to be lucky enough to encounter this owner of labor power on the market. But Marx will show, of course, that it's not an accident at all that the worker is selling their labor power on the market as a commodity, because it's the inevitable result of these workers being expropriated from their land, being dispossessed of their land, leaving them with nothing but their labor power to sell as a commodity, as a way to make a living. But from the perspective of the owner of labor power, how is this encounter experienced by the owner of labor power? In the Grundrisse, Marx wrote this: "It is already contained in the concept of the free laborer that he is a pauper, virtual pauper. According to his economic conditions, he's merely a living labor capacity, necessity on all sides, without the objectivities necessary to realize himself as labor capacity. He can live as a worker only insofar as he exchanges his labor capacity for that part of capital which forms the labor fund. This exchange is tied to conditions which are accidental for him and indifferent to his organic presence. He is thus a virtual pauper." And this quote I've turned into a poem. I call it a communist poem. Après Marx 604, a pauper, virtual pauper, economic conditions, a living labor capacity, necessity on all sides, exchanges labor capacity for capital. This exchange, conditions, accidental. He is thus a virtual pauper. So what is at stake in reconsidering this encounter as a historical conjuncture between labor power and owners of money capital? For me, it leads us to think differently, or to rethink, or to reconceptualize the concept and the figure of the proletariat. I want to emphasize a conception of the proletariat as an existence of someone who has been stripped of everything except for their labor power to sell as a commodity, who has been expropriated, dispossessed, but theoretically speaking, who has not yet inevitably or necessarily been exploited within capitalist production. It is a conception of the proletariat that attends to what I called in my own book, the Proletarian Gamble, which is really a problem of this conjuncture of this encounter. It's also a problem of what Marx called the virtual pauper. And here's where I think Uno's work overlaps with the late thought of Louis Althusser, some of Althusser's last writings, which he called a materialism of the encounter. And I think both Uno and Althusser have one thing at least in common, which is that they want to rethink the proletariat. They want to rethink the figure of the proletariat and to redefine it away from a certain dominant conception which says that the proletariat is simply the result of capitalist exploitation. Uno and Althusser both want to talk about a conception of the proletariat as from the perspective of the precondition for exploitation, but that is not yet necessarily exploited. So Althusser, in his famous text, Underground Current of the Materialism of the Encounter, Althusser said that basically Marx and Engels had two conceptions of the proletariat. One was this virtual pauper approach of the proletariat, economic conditions, necessity on all sides, but no guarantees for an exchange. And then they had a second idea, conception of the proletariat as the result of capitalist production, as the result of capitalist exploitation. And Marx and Engels tended to, even though they had two conceptions, they tended to focus on the second one as the class that was necessarily exploited and the result of capitalist exploitation. But what Althusser wants to do is kind of revive the other conception of the proletariat. So he writes, for example, Marx deliberately leaves the aleatory nature, and aleatory means, prone to chance, basically. Marx leaves the aleatory nature of the encounter and its taking hold to one side in order to think solely in terms of the accomplished fact of the take, and consequently its predestination. This explains why Marx and Engels conceive of the proletariat as a product of big industry, a product of capitalist exploitation, confusing the production of the proletariat with its capitalist reproduction on an extended scale, as if the capitalist mode of production pre-existed one of its essential elements, an expropriated labor force. Here, the specific histories no longer float in history like so many atoms in the void, at the mercy of an encounter that might not take place. Everything is accomplished in advance. The structure precedes its elements and reproduces them in order to reproduce the structure. And I've turned this into another, what I call a communist poem. Après Louis, number 201. the aleatory nature of the encounter, the proletariat as a product of big industry, a product of capitalist exploitation, confusing the production of the proletariat with its capitalist reproduction on an extended scale, an expropriated labor force, the void, an encounter. So Althusser invites us theoretically to reconsider this peculiar void, at least in relation to the encounter between owners of labor power and owners of money, which Marx so clearly established. I would say that we could think of this void as a place where capital, which is simply just one of the many elements that are necessary for the establishment of capitalist society and a capitalist mode of production, in this void, capital is not fundamentally in control of the historical situation. Arguably because capital must encounter labor power, which represents capital's own weakness, its Achilles heel. So I think that when Althusser talks about this strange void and this encounter, it's very analogous to Uno's insistence that whenever we consider the commodification of labor power, we have to recognize that capital cannot avoid passing through this mudi, a place in which there is an absence of reason, where violent forces and antagonistic struggles abound. Could the mudi be another name for what Althusser called the void? Are both Uno and Althusser thinking about this particular place as the epicenter for thinking about the practice and politics of real proletarian struggles, for rethinking the meaning of class struggle in terms of the non-guaranteed character of these struggles? This is how I understand Althusser's notion of the conjuncture, the analysis of which signifies, in his words, an attempt to think not only the contingency of necessity, but also the necessity of contingency at its root. So, I mean, my book, The Proletarian Gamble, was really inspired by Uno and by Althusser, I must say, especially around these problems of contingency. Or to put it differently, when I was doing research, this is when precarious labor, precarity, was first becoming a worldwide phenomenon. And so I tried to, look at this problem at its root, just like Althusser said, to look at its root. So why should we care about contingency and necessity? This is very abstract philosophical concepts, and yet as a historian, I'm saying this is the most important thing. Why should we care about these two concepts of necessity and contingency? Althusser says, it is perhaps no accident that this curious pair of concepts interested above all men who sought in the concepts of encounter and conjuncture a means with which to think not only the reality of history, but above all the reality of politics, not only the essence of reality, but above all the essence of practice, and the link between these two realities in their encounter. In struggle, I say struggle, and at the limit, war. This struggle was the struggle for recognition, but also, well before Hegel, the struggle of all against all that is known as competition, or, when it takes this form, class struggle and its contradictions. And this incredible passage from Althusser I've turned into my final communist poem for my talk, and I'll conclude here. Encounter and conjuncture. Think the reality of history, the reality of politics, the essence of reality, the essence of practice, the link between these two realities in their encounter in struggle. At the limit, war, the struggle for recognition, the struggle of all against all that is known as competition, or, when it takes this form, class struggle and its contradictions. So thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you, Professor Kawashima, for your inspiring lecture. So I think now we are taking the audience's questions. So who has questions, just raise your hand, please, and unmute yourself so we can hear. So please. Okay. We
I
have,
see a hand from Sujin.
yeah, please. Sujin, please just unmute and you can.
Hello. I actually have 3 questions, but maybe I could start with one and then see if other people have questions. Okay, I think I have to digest a lot of the presentation and return to it. But firstly, I just wanted to ask, you made the distinction several times. You mentioned several times a distinction between slavery and wage slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, because I see them as quite interconnected.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure if you were making a distinction between the two, or just, yeah, I just want to hear a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, it's a huge question. I mean, what I think a lot of Marxists, you know, they don't analyze enough the problem and the history of slavery. They want to, Marx included, he does, I mean, it needs to be brought out more that, for example, if you read Das Kapital, volume 3 or parts of volume 1, he does mention problems of slavery as the kind of prehistory to modern wage slavery. And we could say that Marx was very, very aware of this problem, especially in the United States, because Marx analyzed the history of the United States and the Civil War and the huge role, obviously, that slavery played in American history. But he didn't quite, you know, develop that analysis so much. But what he was interested in was, for example, he would look at American slavery in the South, and how the cotton industry in the American South, which was based on slave labor, was how these products were exported to England, okay, which had already abolished slavery in England, but they made all their money basically in England around the cotton industry using American slave labor. So we have this combination of slavery in the US, in the cotton industry, exporting the products of slave labor to England, which is becoming the manufacturing center of the world in mid-19th century, which is using wage labor, which has abolished slave labor and is using only wage labor within the national economy of England. But the English were very happy to use American slave labor, you see. So we have this weird tension. And Marx did identify that. It would be totally wrong to say that Marx did not pay attention to the problem of slavery. I would totally disagree. I mean, he didn't develop it perhaps as much because he was primarily, I would say, interested in looking at wage labor, which is based on the commodification of labor power, right? That's what the English working class, that's how he saw the English working class, defined their kind of wage slavery. But it was also came into being, we could say, English wage labor really came into being in many ways by using American slave labor. You know, before America abolished slavery, the British totally took advantage happily to use American slave labor, but they tried to look good themselves by saying, oh, we English, we're done with slavery. But actually they were totally using American slave labor. You know, when we think of slavery, we should think of it as the commodification of human beings, you know, where a black body from Africa would become a commodity itself, right? the body itself becomes a commodity, sold to an owner, and the owner can do what they wish, what they want with that commodity, the slave. With modern capitalism, or with what Marx called the capitalist mode of production, we see that the body itself does not become a commodity once and for all, like a slave. We sell our labor power, let's say for 8 hours a day, and sell it to the capitalist. And during those 8 hours, the capitalist, sure enough, is going to treat us like a commodity, because they'll think, well, I bought your labor power for 8 hours, so you got to work for me, basically, right? But the idea is that after 5 o'clock, you can go home and your labor power, as it were, will return back to you. And that's, British liberalism at its core. So I think this thing, and sex work, I see this in the chat, sex work. I think sex work would be comparable to the commodification of labor power, but also, is it perhaps the commodification of the body itself directly? Is that a form of slavery, therefore? I still would say sex work would be, it would be still closer to wage labor somehow, because it's temporary, because a slave is, you buy the body of the slave and forever, basically, until you sell it. Sex work, I think, is closer to wage labor, because it's only sold for a definite period of time. So that's what Marx wants to say about wage labor, is that we don't give up we don't give up our ownership of our bodies once and for all. We only kind of give lend it out, as it were, for 8 hours a day, kind of thing. So I think you're right. These are really difficult questions, and these distinctions should be troubled. We should trouble.
Yes, especially when you think about, like when you clock out the pressures and the impact doesn't really disappear, right? It does create like a specific kind of condition for living. If no one else has a question, I will have another question, but also opening it up to everyone else.
Okay, does anyone else have question now for Professor Kawashima? Or I think, Suji, maybe you can continue and continue your another question. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any references that you could recommend of Korean responses by Koreans, like responses by Korean scholars to either yours or Uno's work?
To my work?
Either yours or Uno's.
Or Uno's. Korean responses to my work, in terms of book reviews, kind of thing, or?
Yeah, I'm open to hearing all of it. Book reviews, academic responses, etc.
Well, there's been many reviews, some in the field of Korean studies. I'm trying to remember who they were. I didn't always know them, myself. There were some Korean kind of specialists who were irritated by my book. There was no question, because they thought I didn't use enough Korean materials. That's partly because I have limited Korean linguistic ability. They didn't like the fact that I was often criticizing some of the Korean workers. Basically, the Korean workers, or the Koreans who were opportunistically collaborating with the Japanese colonial empire, I really went after those Koreans. And some Koreans didn't like me, pushing that button. But I wanted to show that, basically, I was not interested in doing a study of the Korean minority. You know what I mean? A lot of people want to just know a history of the Korean minority, and I totally had no interest in that, because that's exactly what the Japanese police are thinking. The Japanese police are only thinking, oh, let's go find some Korean minorities, you know, let's go, where's the Korean minority? That's what the Japanese police and the colonial state, that's how they think. But many Korean specialists, especially I would know sociologists, you know, they love to write about the Korean minority, but they never see that the very way identification of a Korean minority was part of the colonial apparatus, you see. So they didn't like that, because my analysis kind of puts them in this awkward position where they realize, oh my gosh, my entire epistemological framework is totally complicit with the Japanese colonial empire, you know. So that's something.
Well, I think
Yeah.
there's a way to acknowledge it and then go from there, you know, like acknowledge that this minority was co-developed with the Japanese government, and then
That's
you
right.
know,
That's right.
and then go from there. I don't think it has to be completely disengaged in order to have this discussion on class.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so my final question
Mhm.
is, I guess, like, what got you into this work, and could you talk more about like your stake and your personal interest in, yeah, like dedicating your practice to this topic?
Yes, thank you. I guess originally my mother's Korean, my father's Japanese. It was my own kind of interest in my family background and my own, I guess, mixed ethnicity. I was always trying to understand my parents' histories in many ways and the countries they came from. I grew up in the United States in Ohio, where there were very few Asian people around me, and I became interested in that. But the deeper I delved into that kind of history, I kind of began to challenge my own kind of ideas of my own identity, I suppose. And I got sick and tired of being asked to somehow choose which one I like better, Japan or Korea, you know. I would get these endless questions from like my cousins, you know, like, oh, which country do you like better, or which you know, who are you more attracted to, Japanese people or Korean, you know, these kind of silly questions that really nonetheless reveal a kind of deep-rooted national identity that I wanted to overcome. And when I moved to Chicago as a student, I was also a blues musician, and I was playing music in the west side of Chicago, and saw so much segregation and racism and police brutality and systemic poverty and things like that. And I didn't understand how that could happen. And none of the political ideologies that my parents gave me, for example, my parents were staunch Democrats in America, but none of those ideologies really helped me to understand these problems that I saw in Chicago that pertain to racism and poverty. And so Marxist thought really became something I became interested in, because I thought it could explain these problems, you know, better than what I had been given by my parents in terms of a political ideology. So since I was basically 19, I've always been interested in Marxist theory and Marxist philosophy. And it helped me to think of myself not only as simply as a racialized person, you know, or it helped me think of myself more universally as, for example, as a worker, you know, or as someone who has to sell their labor power as a commodity, like so many other people. I was tired of being called a minority. You know, I didn't want to be a minority all the time, every day, and being reminded, oh, you're a minority. I realized through my studies that these concepts, you know, are not neutral. They're constructs, And so I was able to, through Marxist theory, kind of discover something more universal about myself that wasn't always relegated to this little corner in the room called the minority. You know, I was sick of being called a minority, and I'm still sick of being called a minority. You know, even from my Korean and Japanese friends, they'll say things like, because I play music too, they'll say, "Oh, what's it like playing blues music as a minority?" You know, and I said, "Man, I don't even use those terms to think about my music. You know, I don't think about that." I said, "You've internalized that discourse of being a minority too much. You know, we should think more universally." You know, so these are some of the things that I guess I could say have sustained my research all these years. You know, doesn't mean I mean, but for sure we still have to continue to relentlessly critique racism, its connections to class formation, questions of gender. You know, we have to ruthlessly critique, you know, these problems of sexism, homophobism, and racism, and class domination. But theoretically, it gets so difficult how to disentangle all of these problems. And we need solid theory, I would argue, to help guide us analyze these messy, concrete situations. But nowadays, I've noticed in the past, I would say 20 years, there's a real reaction against theory. And I don't know why, except that it just has led to a lot of vulgar empiricism, you know, a lot of vulgar positivist analysis where people think, oh, I don't want to do theory, theories, you know. I think that's a big problem nowadays. So after I did my historical research, I wanted to show the theoretical core of that historical research. And I want to argue that, you know, theory and historical research are not opposites. You know, actually historical analysis, concrete, empirical, archival analysis for me is the highest expression of theory. You know, so we shouldn't think of them as polar opposites, as many people would like us to believe. Lenin, for example, said concrete analysis of the concrete situation is the highest expression of theory, and I took that literally. You know, and I think we need to emphasize that nowadays.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kawashima, for your answer. So does anyone have other questions? Or maybe can I just propose one question following your theoretical analysis? Okay, so first, thank you again for the really inspiring lecture. And I want to follow the comparative and connective approach like you adopted between the Foucauldian and Marxist analysis.
Yeah.
And as I see from your work and the reading you provided with us, what I read from the commodification of labor power and the different perception of it between the individuals, the root and the ruling groups, like I am now wondering if just let us depart from the Foucauldian sense of subjectivity. So is the sense of subjectivity somehow can become a key factor for individuals to face, to experience, to navigate, and even, if possible, to overcome what you have said, overcome the capitalist order, the capitalist ruling. And is it also the core factor for what Uno argued like the necessity of revolution to overthrow the capitalist mode of production and its inevitable and periodic crisis? Thank you.
Yes, I think for me, it's been so exciting to try to do theoretical research to connect Foucault's research and Marx's research. To look at problems of subjection and subjectivation in Foucault's terms, and to link them to the problem of the commodification of labor power. I think many Marxists need to do this in their analysis, but they usually don't. On the other hand, many Foucaultians are very brilliant about how the subject is formed under regimes of power knowledge, but they have no clue how it's connected to economic realities of their own everyday life, you know. So where I see the kind of convergence between these two is around, yes, exactly, the commodification of labor power for me is kind of another way to talk about the subject and how the subject is formed, how the subject is subjected to different kinds of power and knowledge. And basically, you know, what Foucault was trying to show was basically, you know, what happens after all these populations are expropriated and dispossessed and before they're exploited in the factories, right? So Foucault says there's this kind of a gap between expropriation and exploitation that Marxists usually just assume that expropriation will lead directly to exploitation. But Foucault wants to say, no, 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 no. There's this whole history between these two moments, and we got to study that history, you know, as a field of biopolitical and disciplinary power. For example, the prison system, right? To discipline people, to train them, to make them docile, liberal subjects so that when they get out of prison, if they can get out of prison, they're going to go to work and be a good wage worker. You know, Foucault's saying, I'm going to help you Marxists to show that, you know, it's not simply natural that we have all these wage workers, you know, working in the factories who are so docile, you know, who are so easily manipulated by the capitalists. Foucault's saying, I'm going to show you a whole institutional history that led to that. And you Marxists should know that. I'm trying to help your analysis. But many Marxists are like, whatever, Michel, you know. So we have to change that. On the other hand, we have to tell Foucaultians that when we talk about biopolitical power, disciplinary power, these are not totally distinct and separated from the world of commodification, you see. But, you know, this is where it gets tricky that it's just a question of studying, you know. I mean, how do you study all of this stuff, you know? But we need to basically read a lot of Foucault and a lot of Marx for me. And at the center is this problem of the question of labor power, you know. And so that's you know, what I'm interested in, what I'm trying to write more on with my comrade Gavin Walker. You know, we're really trying to re-theorize labor power. You know, most people who don't know the work of Marx, they only think of labor, you know, like David Ricardo, you know. But Marx invented this new category called labor power, you know. So you can always tell a Marxist from a non-Marxist if they don't use the word labor power. Your bourgeois liberal type will always use labor, and they're talking about workers and stuff. Marx has a totally different way to approach labor, which is an activity of working. He says, we're going to theorize labor power, which is a capacity or potential to work. And when we sell labor power as a commodity, then we are put to work, then we labor, you know. But we need to have a distinction between labor and labor power. That's one of the basic problems. And Foucault was very much aware of that, very much so. If you read his works from the early 70s and leading up to Discipline and Punish, but even his last writings, some of his last writings on biopolitics, if you read it closely, he's very, very much still trying to talk to Marxists and refer to the category of labor power. I think it's totally fascinating, but most Foucaultians don't have a clue about Foucault's kind of signaling to Marxists, you know, and many Marxists are totally oblivious to Foucault, you know, so we have to be a bridge, I think, between them, and to combine, to basically why? To proliferate points of resistance, to create more points of struggle, you know. That's what Foucault was interested in. Points of struggle beyond, for example, the factories, you know. Marxists in the 50s, they were pretty much, you know, thinking of class struggle in the factory system. Someone like Foucault was saying, look, I'm all for that, but we should also proliferate points of resistance and refusal and revolutionary practice in many areas of society, including these institutions, right? So I think it's, thank you for that question, because for me, I think it's one of the biggest divides in the social sciences and humanities, tragically, you know, almost stupidly. You know, I just think it's a stupid thing that Foucauldians ignore Marx and Marxists ignore Foucault. It totally doesn't make any sense to me. And yet, you know, they have their little identity badges and they go off on their own way. But I think we need to make some connections and bridges between them.
Thank you so much for your answer. Like, I must say, like, from my past studies, I'm always taught to, because my study was based on the Foucauldian analysis of biopower, like in the pandemics, but I was always told to avoid engage too deeply with the Marxist things. But I often keep in my mind, like, there are so many connections between each other, and I need to think about it. And thank you so much for providing me with more clarity for this, and I will definitely do so in the future to see
I wrote a,
connections.
yeah, no, you may want to check out, I'll type it in, there's a journal called Positions Asia Critique, the End of Area, edited by Sakai and Walker, and I have an article in there, and I think it's one of my better works. So there's this article, there's a journal kind of for Asian studies, but kind of a left journal, and they wrote this, there's a volume on the end of area studies, and I wrote a thing on Marx and Foucault in there. It came out in 2020 maybe, no, 2019, before the pandemic. So, and that kind of is my reading of Foucault on biopolitics in connection to Marx. So please check it out, and hopefully it'll be useful for you.
Yeah, definitely I will check it out. Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, but I have two questions.
Sure.
First question, I really appreciate it. Thank you for the whole lecture. So I really appreciated the contextualization of Korean workers' uprisings. I think that really like situated the discussion about labor power for me. And that got me thinking about methods. So it looks like you sort of traced revolutionary uprisings among the working class, among the Korean working class in Japan during that era. What other methods do you use to trace revolutionary uprisings? And what, if any, can you say about dialectical materialism as a method? And then I'll ask my second question after.
Yeah. Yes, dialectical materialism, historical materialism is something I've tried to kind of, I've always had a bit of a troubled relation to what we call historical materialism, even though it's also the kind of given for me as a Marxist. I would say other methods, I mean, it comes down to also kind of a Foucauldian method to look at, questions of power and discourse analysis. That's a method which doesn't always come down to the problem of contradiction, right? So dialectical materialism is really about contradiction, but someone like Foucault is interested in problems of power and discourse that don't always lead to simply problems of contradiction, So in a discourse analysis, you can have positions where they don't necessarily contradict each other in a discourse, a discursive formation. You could have one person saying something, another person saying something. They don't necessarily contradict each other. And that's part of the formation of a discourse, right? So what I looked at in my book, in the Korean struggles, I would look at their discourses also. I did a discourse analysis that would attend to their voices, hear what they're saying. I would attend I would listen to what the state is saying. And many of these things were not necessarily contradictory, There would even be complicity, right, between some Korean workers who may be struggling against Japanese colonialism, but what they're saying in the Japanese state, which is oppressing Korea, sometimes there would be a consistency between them, And that has to be brought out in historical analysis as well. So revolutionary uprisings are often contradictory. They are trying to negate and oppose a source of domination, say, but they're also, when we look at a discourse formation, it gets kind of messier in some ways because we can also see points of complicity, And I think those points of complicity, which can ruin a revolutionary situation, which can diffuse a revolutionary uprising, those need to be analyzed just as much as the revolutionary uprisings themselves, For example, as I mentioned, some opportunistic Korean collaborators with the Japanese police, this has to be accounted for because, basically the Japanese police got a group of Korean leaders to kind of dominate Korean workers and to prevent Korean workers from having revolutionary uprisings. But the Japanese didn't want to do that by themselves, so they would recruit Koreans to basically repress their fellow countrymen, Then we'd have Korean on Korean violence, So, so those were problems that the Korean revolutionaries had to deal with every day, every day. But that's not always simply about a dialectical problem, it's just a huge struggle, right? It's a huge struggle. So I would say methodologically, we need to supplement dialectical materialism and historical materialism with basically analyses of these kinds of complicities, I would say.
Thank you, but I think we need to take the final question, the last one, so we can
I
ask.
think Sujin had
Yeah,
a follow-up.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So we can ask Sujin to make the last
Uh,
question.
It might be a very quick question. So Stephanie, did you ask your second question?
I didn't, but please.
It might just be a quick question. So do you have any like figures, like Korean figures that were complicit, that are like written about or like alluded to, that I could maybe research more into? Like I'm sure there were a lot. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying, like, are there like some interesting figures or a figure? Because I'm quite interested in like acknowledging the complicity, but also, seeing them as human and seeing what their desires were and what the pressures were as well.
For sure. Actually, the only two individuals that I wrote about in my history book, The Proletarian Gamble, one was a Japanese police bureaucrat named Maruyama Tsurukichi, and he worked with this Korean guy, Pak Chung-gum. And this is in my 5th chapter of the Proletarian Gamble. It's all about their complicit relationship and how the Japanese police wanted to use Korean welfare organizations as a kind of front line for police work. So the Japanese colonial empire, the colonial government, as well as the metropolitan Japanese government, they used welfare organizations as what they called preventive policing. And we see Pak Chung-gum, who was basically just this kind of like businessman selling ginseng originally. And he basically proposed to the Maruyama and the police departments to create a Korean welfare organization for poor, unemployed, impoverished Korean workers in Japan. And so what my 5th chapter is about is really about this welfare organization, which is basically a policing organization. So we see Pak Chung-gum, who then gets paid he gets paid a lot of money, and then he becomes the first Korean to become elected into the Japanese parliament in 1934. So I think my chapter is one of the few chapters or few analysis of this problem in the English language. It's well known in different Korean and Japanese publications, but in English, I think that's one place to start. In terms of Korean collaborators in Korea, I would say you should look at the works of Bruce Cummings or Shin Gi-wook out in California, Shin Gi-wook, who talks a little bit about colonial era Korean collaborators, but I think it's a topic a lot of people don't want to deal with, and it's hard to analyze it, and it can get very ideological very quickly, and we need to do this very carefully, very, very, very carefully.
Okay, I think many of us may have many other questions for you, but unfortunately, we need to conclude the lecture now because of the time limit, and all the things today is recorded, so we can perhaps share it afterwards. And also, Professor Kawashima, can we ask if you can send us the slides you used today for the lecture, so we can use it for the future studies?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So this is the end of our first Canon Challenge lecture this year, and a huge thank you to Professor Kawashima for your lecture, and see you everyone. Have a nice
Thanks so
evening.
much for organizing.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.